I'll show you how I would paint a child's eye that's looking directly at us. So I'm going to start by using this number 2 bright brush. And I'll just start by getting some of the basic angles and placement of the eye, sort of thinking about where I want to position it on the panel. Actually, I can already tell that I want to move it over. If you want to make any changes, you can just dip your rag into the walnut alkyd medium and kind of erase in that way. For this eye, I think I want it to be fairly centered on the panel. Maybe not completely centered. Maybe I'll have it a little bit over to the left. Maybe I'll kind of put a dot at either side. This will be the tear duct, this will be the outer corner of the eye, and this is kind of the eyelid, the eyelash. So I'll just kind of mark in those basic angles. With children's eyes, you can kind of round those angles out. I'm still looking at the kind of angles that these rounded forms are kind of making up, but then especially on this lower lid, I really want it to like wrap, like especially at the corner, you know, I don't want like a point. I want to sort of have it wrap around the eyeball. And then right here, it kind of goes in and then swoops around. And this angle actually ends up curving a little bit as well. So you can basically kind of curve everything out a little bit on children's features. They have big rounded eyes and sort of juicy puffy skin. So we've got this teeny little indication of her lower eyelid, a little indication of the eye socket, and then an indication of the brow. The iris is partially covered by the upper eyelid, and it takes up half of the white of the eye. So if you were to add up this space and this space and kind of put it together, that would be your iris. So I can tell that I need to make my iris just a little bit bigger, and you can kind of connect the pupil to the cast shadow that comes down from the upper eyelid. So that's really all we need in terms of like a block in. You know, remember to check the sort of measurement between the tear duct, the relationship between the tear duct and this outer corner of the eye. I think I can just shift mine down slightly. And then from there, I'm going to scale up to this slightly larger number 6 filbert brush. And we'll start by mixing up a shadow color mixture. So I'll use this base shadow color mixture. I like to lighten it with a little bit of base flesh color, thin down the shadows with a bit of walnut alkyd medium, and even a little bit of this Gamblin solvent-free gel. It makes like a slightly thicker, not too thick, but just a really nice consistency. There's like quite a bit of warmth to the shadows in this case with the lighting, so I'm going to add a bit of yellow ochre. Let's lighten it up a bit more. Children's shadows often it might look nice if they're sort of slightly subtler. You definitely want to capture the shadows still. There's always the tendency to make the shadows too light, so you want to make sure you're not doing that. But as opposed to when you're painting like a chiseled male face or something and you have dark shadows, slightly softer shadows on children can look quite nice. So I'm going to start by just putting some of that onto the canvas and just seeing what that looks like. And let's actually cool it down with a little bit of blue and a little bit of gray, and that'll also lighten it up a little bit. It looks like towards the inside of that note, it gets a little bluer in here, and towards the outside, we could probably mix a little bit more yellow ochre. I'm going to kind of do sort of painterly brush strokes as I work. So let's add a little more yellow ochre, a little bit of base flesh color as we move to the outer portion. And just kind of introduce that in. Again, I'm trying to keep the strokes kind of painterly. And then below the eye, I feel like it's slightly warmer, so I'm going to mix a bit of alizarin permanent in and kind of mix all of that up. So some of the yellow ochre stuff, some of the cooler stuff with a bit of gray mixed in. And let's just introduce that in. Actually, I think we could lighten it. It'll look nice if this note is a little bit subtle, the sort of indication of the eye socket underneath the eye. And then I'm going to shift down to this number 2 bright brush, and let's move into the light side now. So we've basically got the basic indication of our shadows kind of loosely marked in. And so now I'll use some base flesh color. Let's add a little bit of pink. Children's skin it sort of tends towards the more kind of pinky flesh colors, as opposed to like a tanned look that would have more yellow ochres or even some burnt sienna in it. And I've also added a bit of gray, and I'm going to lighten it a little bit as well. And so for the light side, I'm not mixing any medium in. So I mixed medium into the shadows to make them thin and transparent, and in the lights we'll keep it more opaque as we go. And let's go ahead and mix a bit more white in. Yeah, and that's a good sort of starting point. And I'm just going to kind of bring that through into the lights, just kind of starting with an overall kind of light side and an overall shadow side. We have a little bit of variation, already kind of indicated in the shadows. If we mix a little bit of this shadow mixture in with this light side flesh color as this eyelid rolls to the right, I think that will get us to the right note. Let's actually a little bit pinker, so a little bit of alizarin permanent. So I'm just getting a slightly darker, slightly pinker tone. And let's add into the light side some areas that get a bit more into these orangey flesh color notes, so a bit more of the base flesh color. And I'm just going to kind of bring some of that in right along the place where the lights meet the shadows. So basically, as the lights roll towards the shadows, they're getting a little warmer, just a little bit richer in color. There's actually a little bit of light side coming through right in here, so I can just put that in. And let's get the shape of the lights that kind of bring out the tear duct. And then for the whites of the eyes, it's really important that we make the whites of the eyes dark enough, like they're a dark gray. They're a similar tone to the flesh around it. They're just like cooler. And we don't want it to be like screaming cool. I might even mix a little bit of the base flesh color into it, which will just tone down the coolness, just make it more of a neutral gray. And let's start by just bringing a little bit of that in, just so that we can see what it looks like. I'm actually going to start with that. In the center of some of these notes, I'll probably lighten up, but actually I'll just start by putting this in first, and then I'm going to get a little bit more white and mix that in and kind of lighten up in the center of this gray note, which will just kind of give a little bit of the sense of form to the eyeball. It kind of darkens towards the edge and kind of lightens towards the center. I'm holding off on the darkest notes. It goes through a bit of an awkward stage, like I'm really getting anxious to get these blacks in, the black of the eyelash, for example. But I'm just kind of creeping up to that. So next, let's get into the overall colored part of the eye. For that, I'm going to use some Prussian blue and some gray. And that looks like screamingly blue, right? So let's desaturate it with a bit of the base flesh color, base shadow side mixture. And you can see how nicely that desaturates it. It just makes it less intense. And maybe let's desaturate it even a little bit more. Maybe lighten it. It's lightest in the center of the iris. Of course, not the pupil, but in the center of the iris. And then it's darker at the edges. But for now, let's actually get this overall note in, and then I'm going to shift down to my very small brush now. This is just my number 0, like the smallest it gets. And let's actually get into those blacks. For the darkest notes, I always mix oil in. So every single time I use black, I mix some walnut alkyd medium in. And I also very often, almost always, mix a little bit of something warm in. So this is some alizarin permanent and some base shadow color mixture mixed together. You could also use burnt sienna. Anything warm will do. But this is just creating a nice thin, transparent, rich, blacky brown note. And let's just kind of get now into that line of the eyelash. This is just like an initial pass, just to kind of give us something to work with. And then kind of wiggle the brush down and let it kind of meld into the iris and introduce that darkest note around the outer perimeter of the iris. And let's actually introduce a bit more alizarin permanent into that note and just let it kind of segue into this slightly browner note as that line moves forward. And then a little bit more alizarin permanent, a little bit of cad red even. And I'm looking at this shape. It feels like this is a little bit long. The shape actually should kind of curve down and end a little bit sooner than what I've got. So I'm just shifting the tear duct in to the left a little bit. So as we're working, as we're doing the color lay-in, we can sort of wiggle, the sort of wiggle stroke, the brush along some of the edges where wet paint meets wet paint to just create a nice subtle soft edge as we're working. And let's do that now too for, for this edge. It'll actually kind of suggest sort of texture of the iris, the kind of lines, the crystally lines that make up the iris. And even on this upper edge, in fact, let's enhance it. So there's a cast shadow that comes down from the upper eyelid onto the white of the eye. So more than doing eyelashes right now, let's actually look to kind of get that sense of the cast shadow coming down and sort of fading in. So we're kind of dealing with form, a lot, kind of getting that sense of form. And on this too, so instead of it just being a line, we'll kind of wiggle on it with a little bit of black on my brush, which mixes into the gray. Let's actually go ahead now and definitely get this pupil in. I'm just using pure black for that. We can kind of also get really dark now, pure black into this top part of the iris. So do you see how it's creating almost like a cross-hatching at the edge? Just a small little cross-hatching, so it doesn't feel cut out. It feels like a nice, subtle little edge. And then let's get a bit of a clearer sense of the shadows on the lower eyelid. I'm actually going to use some burnt sienna and some alizarin permanent, and maybe a little yellow ochre too, and just kind of draw in the kind of line, the kind of crease here. And then on the top edge of that line, we get into a little shadow pattern, like a little shadow that occurs on the underside as that form turns down. And then it kind of actually melds into this whole area is a little bit of a shadow side before it turns out into the light right at the tear duct. And it connects in a certain way. So just bringing a bit more clarity to that shape of the shadow. It sort of connects in a nice soft way. And actually I'm using quite a small brush. Sometimes you'll find you sort of struggle to get the blended softness if you are using too small of a brush. I'm just gonna shift up to this slightly larger bright brush, which will give me the ability to just sort of soften things with a broader expanse, because the brush is a little bit bigger. And now let's go a little darker into the line of the crease of the upper eyelid. So I'm using some alizarin permanent and a little bit of black, and let's just state that line, really looking at the angles but also the curvature. So there's kind of an apex here and an apex here. It's a little wider here and a little tighter and narrower here. And we could also get a little bit darker right in here. The eye is sort of turning into the shadow. Even the eyelid sort of turns into a slightly darker note on either side. So that basically shows you how I would approach the color lay-in of the eye. And next we'll look at how to deal with refinements. Okay, so next we're going to start to develop the big form modeling, in other words, darkening towards the edges of the form and kind of getting the big sense of big form modeling. And we'll also be looking at describing 3 tones and 3 different planes for each of the different areas of the feature. Mix up a color using some of the base flesh color, some yellow ochre, a little burnt sienna, and a little bit of this shadowy stuff that we used before. So I'm kind of mixing up a kind of sort of a half tone. It's like not the lightest light and it's not as dark as our darkest dark. And let's also just darken it a little bit more as it rolls into the right hand side. It too kind of gets into this darker plane. I'm going to straighten that line out a little bit, and then let's get into the lightest center part. It's already kind of there, but let's just kind of bring it through one more time. Notice how I'm painting across the form. And then we also want to get the sense of it. There's sort of a puffiness, like a cute sort of plumpness to all of the forms. And so it kind of darkens as it rolls down towards the lash line too. So I'll just mix a little bit of some of this reddish brown stuff, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. So I'm kind of doing this sort of wiggle stroke. See, I'm kind of wiggling my brush like this, like a little bit, as I kind of run it along the edge that I'm introducing this on. And so it's just getting that sense of form. Then I'll lighten it up a little bit, just mixing some of these lighter notes in, and kind of wiggle one more time, kind of on that transition, kind of even gradation, just a sort of blending. So that's really like the big form modeling, the big turning of that form into the lower plane of the eyelid. Let's go in with a little bit of a cooler note. A lot of the time the lightest notes are actually slightly cool. So I use some base flesh color, some white, and a little bit of gray to create a note that's just a little bit on the cool side as the lightest note. And then also as the plane kind of moves back into space towards the line of the crease, it kind of darkens back into there too. So I'm kind of going to introduce that slightly darker note as it pushes back into space. And so just kind of similar to how I treated this front edge, I'm just kind of wiggling it, just kind of placing it on that back note. This can get, it sort of turns into shadow right here. And then let's do a similar type of thing now on this big form. This form is like a really beautiful form on people, and it's also a little bit tricky. So we really want to get the sense of this being part of the light side, and then it kind of gradually getting darker, darker, darker in a really progressive way as it moves to the line of the lash. So I'm going to use some burnt sienna, yellow ochre, a little bit of this gray, and let's just see what that looks like. The note that I have here isn't exactly right. It might be a little bit too dark and cool. Let's mix a little more burnt sienna and a little bit of this lighter note in. So I'll just kind of bring that through and kind of wiggle it up to this shape, which is part of the light side here. And again, it might obscure the line initially of the crease of the upper eyelid, but we'll go back into that. I'm really going to deepen into that note. I'm getting a little lighter as it moves up, up away from the crease. Just getting a little lighter. This is still part of the shadow side right here, but it's a lighter part of the shadow side. Let's mix up a rich, warm note with some alizarin permanent, some burnt sienna, a teeny bit of black, and some medium. This is Gamblin solvent-free gel right here. A lot of the time I actually really like a combination of the walnut alkyd medium and the Gamblin solvent-free gel. And I'm just gonna restate that line. Oh, it's actually a little too dark. Let's mix a bit of just the warmer, lighter notes together. It's nice if this line is rich, so not too blacky, grayy, a little bit more sort of warm. And then, so you can see I've kind of done the line, and now I'm going to take the excess off my brush and kind of do airplane strokes on the upper edge of it to kind of blend it upwards so that it's got a sharp edge on the bottom but a soft edge on the top. And just getting into the lower part of this, I'm mixing a bit more of this kind of lighter just, it's not quite as dark as the line, but it also is kind of dark. So yeah, and I'm sort of softening it out. Let's actually just do a little bit of lightening right here so that this too moves from a lighter note to a darker note as it rolls into the crease of the eye. And then actually this right here is a bit sharp, but the corner of the eye blends a little bit into that. So let's just take some of this darker note and just kind of swoosh a little bit of it, let it carry up into that. Some of this will be covered by the eyelashes, but we're just kind of setting it up for that. And then let's do a similar type of thing on this front area. It's going to be a little bit cooler, so just a little bit more gray mixed in. It's maybe even a little purpley, so maybe a little bit of red mixed in. And I'll just bring that in. And that might be good. The initial note that I put down was slightly on the dark side. I did want to like separate the light side and the shadow side really clearly, you know, initially, so it really served its purpose in that way. But I think as we get into the finishing, you know, the finish, and since we're looking to really capture like the sweetness of the young child, having slightly lighter shadows is probably gonna serve us well. I'm just gonna kind of work this edge a little bit, and I'm warming it up slightly with some burnt sienna and yellow ochre, and there's like a little bit of the base flesh color in to lighten it. And now we'll lighten the light side note right here just a drop, so that there's a little bit more clarity to the fact that we've got this form actually turning right into the light side right here. It happens in a really soft way, but there's a definite turn from light side to shadow side occurring in this area. And yeah, again, this part here, this whole upper like part above the eye is a really beautiful form on people. And it often does, there's a kind of bony structure right here, so it often does go from shadow turning up into the light. Kind of want to still pull out that light even a little bit more. Sometimes when these turns, these shifts occur with really soft edges, even if there's a fairly good tonal shift, you know, we might not actually perceive it as much unless there's, you know, even a little bit more tonal shift. So just bumping that up a drop. And then let's carve out the lower plane of the upper eyelid with a nice warm kind of brownish note. So this is alizarin permanent, some burnt sienna, and some black. And I'll basically just kind of introduce that in here. This is the underplane of the upper eyelid. We actually see a little bit right in here. And let's kind of carve out a little bit of a stronger line here. And maybe we'll go a little darker in here as well. I'm going to take my really small brush and just kind of soften some of those edges. So I don't want it to look like a line. I want it to look like it's a form, you know, like this form is turning into the crease. So I'm just going to kind of like, once again, but in a smaller way now, soften the edge right above this line so that it's, yeah, a form turning into the crease, so that the lower edge of this line has a sharp edge, but the upper edge of this line fades gradually into that darkest note. And that's how you can make something, you know, look like a form instead of looking like a line. Okay, so now let's carve out some of the planes of the lower eyelid. Let's start with that little light rim of thickness that's so important, that is like the top plane of the lower eyelid. And I'm just going to kind of bring that in. I think I could actually move a little bit of this tear duct area, sort of the white of the eye, the way that it's like carrying up, the way that the lower eyelid carries up onto the white of the eye. Right now it's just coming up a little teeny bit too high. So I'm going in with a grayish note because the white of the eye kind of gradates into this slightly darker you know, slightly grayer note. Let's go ahead and use that note in some of the darker areas of the white of the eye and sort of work. We'll go ahead and work the form of the white of the eye so that it too has that sense of big form modeling, darkening as it moves to the top, where there's a cast shadow from the upper eye coming down onto it, and also darkening. And so I'm just mixing a little bit of black actually. It's like just a slightly darker version of gray than what I was using before. And it also is darkening as it moves to the right. So getting those two motions set and softening the edge. Now I can use a little bit of the base flesh color and some white, and let's just kind of work the tear duct a little bit. It could sort of pull, there's a thickness, like a kind of juiciness to this form. It has a lightest area in the center, like it too has the sense of big form modeling. It too darkens towards the edges. It has a lighter part in the center. And I'm just kind of working through that. It doesn't meet a note that's quite as dark right here, so I'm going to bring a lighter note in and actually carry up a little bit of a lighter note. It's mixing into the gray, which is what it should be doing. That really works for that area. Yeah, and so with the little light rim of thickness on the top ledge of the lower eyelid, what it looks like basically happens is right in here, it's quite light, and over here, it's actually a little bit darker, like this plane is lighter and the top plane is darker. So I'm just gonna kind of do that. Also, it looks like this could come out. There's a bit more thickness to it. The lower eyelashes sort of help describe that too, but I'm just holding off on doing the lower eyelash, you know, any of the eyelashes actually, until the end. So I'm just kind of setting up the big forms, and then I could go with a little bit of a lighter note right in here, actually lighter still. So I'll use, it's not pure white, it's kind of a pinky white, so, or a fleshy white. So the base flesh color and white works well, and it kind of has a certain curvature to it, especially like right here. It actually gets pushed out a little bit by the iris, like, well, by the cornea, the clear dome in front of the iris. So there's just, you know, it's not perfectly straight. It actually has a little bit of a curvature as it gets pushed on by the cornea. What we can do now is kind of work the transitions, like they're happening a bit suddenly right now. So I can kind of bring a half tone that just segues between this darkest note and the lightest note. And again, that'll just kind of make it, you know, look sort of like full and just capture the kind of quality of the skin and of those forms. And this is actually just a little too dark, so I'll just bring this slightly lighter note in through there. And let's soften this transition as well by just wiggling, just a little wiggle stroke. Do you see how it just brings the two colors of wet paint that are side by side and kind of merges them together in just a nice sort of wet into wet kind of way. And I think one thing that's kind of enhancing these forms in a way that's not totally appealing is the way these brush strokes are working. So I'm actually going to kind of get that sense of the light plane. You know, this disappears into the light, and there's a certain unity to these lights so that they're not like such separate sharp shapes. Let's bring a little more light over here. Yeah, and then let's go into the colored part of the eye more. This is kind of the fun part. We sort of hold off a little bit on it and set everything up, you know, sort of for that. Let's bring, like, the very central kind of rim of the iris has definitely a kind of crystally, I would say a turquoise, like a slightly greeny, like I'm mixing a little yellow ochre into my Prussian blue and white. And let's just kind of wiggle that through. Also, we'll want to make sure that the eye at this point, this is an eye that's looking at us. So it's a perfect circle, of course, covered at the bottom and covered at the top by the eyelids, but it's, you know, it's not an ellipse, it's a real circle. And so I'm kind of just like wiggling, you know, I'm kind of just doing a little stroke that kind of replicates the effect of the kind of lininess, not overdoing it. Sometimes we'll kind of overstate things like this, like it's just a suggestion. And now I'm doing kind of slightly bigger lines that kind of extend out just a little bit more, kind of irregular, you know, not perfectly like even. Let's also get a slightly bluer note and start to get some of the effects of the light coming on top of the eye. Let's use some medium, and I'll wipe my brush off on my rag to take the excess off, and we can just kind of get some glassy effects going. It's always good to use, you know, really wet, kind of medium rich paint when you're doing anything glassy, just because it actually kind of replicates the glassy feel because it's an actually transparent color that we're putting on. And let's at the same time be kind of working the white of the eye and the shape of the iris. I think we want to make sure that we capture the sense of it being darker here and moving to a slightly lighter note as it moves to the center on the white of the eye. And I'm looking at the negative space that's created with the white of the eye. Like I'm noticing that it can just pull over slightly, you know, further than it is right now. The white has this kind of long, you know, pointy extension on it kind of thing. And then on this side, I think we just need to kind of smooth the shape of the iris a little bit, maybe soften the edge, maybe get a little bit more of that sense of it getting darker and warmer into the corner. Do you guys see that? Like it's not getting darker and grayer, it's actually getting darker and redder. Maybe there's like a little bit of blood vessels showing, or maybe it's even reflected light, you know, from the eyelid that, you know, casting into the shadow. Let's just sort of go actually one shade darker on the gray as it gets to the far edge over here. So we're really pushing that sense of form, the sense of it turning, the turning of the form. And let's go into the tear duct as well. I'm using this alizarin permanent, maybe a bit of cad red, little base flesh color. I'm not sure. Let's see how that looks. And I'm going to kind of pull this down a drop. There's a kind of certain curving shape to this where it meets the tear duct. You could kind of put a couple of these little watery highlights in here. And let's work the edge of the iris. This is some Prussian blue and black. I'm mixing it into a little bit of the other blue that I was using, just so it's not screamingly dark. And let's bring it, let's just bring it, actually a little bit darker would be good, a bit more black. Yeah, so let's start by actually bringing it kind of smoothly in to the whole outer perimeter of the circle and the upper edge. Again, we'll put the eyelashes in last, so kind of ignoring the eyelashes for now. And then also into the other side. And then we'll soften this edge after that. Because the iris is scooped shape, like because it's concave and it scoops inward, that's why we get this effect of it getting darker at the edge. So now I'll pick up some of the lighter bluer color of the eye and just sort of use that to kind of wiggle along this edge. And actually, let's do that on this side too. And then we'll work the top. There's some specific shapes that are sort of created in the top, so we'll really observe those and try to replicate that. Like I think this comes down in almost like a sort of squared sort of way. And then this has a little softer edge. This too, the pupil could have a slightly softer edge. Let's use some of the blue of the eye And especially right underneath the highlight. I'm not going for the lightest note of the highlight yet. I'm kind of building up to that, but right on the sort of outer perimeter, I'm kind of just dabbing, almost like cross-hatching. Yeah, and then maybe this actually isn't quite as dark as what I've got it. Now I'm just going to wipe my brush off. Now let's just do a little, actually this edge is pretty good. Let's just do a little wiggle to soften out this edge. Now I'm going to get my 1/4 inch grainer. So this is a brush that has some long hairs and some short hairs. It's really amazing for doing eyelashes. I'm going to use some of this blackish brown. It's just like, let's just actually mix it up so you can see what I'm using. It's some black, some base shadow color mixture, and a little burnt sienna. And I'm going to use some oil, mix that all together. And so see, I'll do a practice brush stroke on the palette to kind of show you. So with the amount that this brush is loaded right now, if I do the eyelashes, it'll come out like really thick and clogged up. So I'm going to take the excess off my brush. There's still a little bit on there. And now, actually I might have taken too much off. Now it does fine little lines, and I'm not pushing very hard. I'm going to lift a little bit more paint up. Yeah, so you can kind of see there's you want the paint watery and fluid so that you can get the kind of liney effect, and then you want to make sure that it's loaded the right amount and that you have a very soft touch, like I'm barely letting the bristles touch the palette. So what I'm going to do, and if you're like worried about doing the lashes, you could totally wait until your painting's dry and do them, you know, once it's dry, in case you do it and then you actually want to try it again, then you can just wipe it off and no harm done, you know? So with the eyelashes, we're seeing it kind of pulls down, and then we see the kind of texture of the eyelash on the top. And kids have, they don't have pure black eyelashes. It's a nice kind of subtle, kind of brownish color. She's not wearing any makeup, obviously. And yeah, I'm basically just creating a soft little edge that's kind of varied. So it curves this way initially, and then it's kind of curving up towards us, and then we see just a little hint of it kind of curving over that way. We do see even a little bit more of, like, it's basically coming down and then curving up. So we could actually get a little bit more of that, it coming down before curving up. And then with the lower lashes, again, we're going to want to do it so fine, make sure that there's just the right amount of paint on your brush, maybe do a couple practices, and then I'll just start right at the edge where the bend in the plane occurs and do a light little curling and pulling. And it doesn't have to be exactly like what it shows in the photo, it just has to be something fine that just kind of has a little suggestion of kind of eyelash texture. And yeah, on the lower lashes, it is occurring right at the break between the top plane and the lower plane. And sometimes at the end, I'll take a very small brush and even do a couple individual lashes, but we'll look at that after. So I'm going to wipe my brush off. This one lash here I don't really like, so I'm actually just going to soften it into what's there on the painting. This grainer brush is a really good brush for blending, so I'm actually going to go ahead and use it. This is I've wiped the paint off, so it's a clean brush, and I'm just going to kind of go through if there's any, brush strokey parts that are, maybe obscuring the form. I like brush strokes. I love the edges being, brush strokey, but if there's places where it's stopping the turning of the form, it's a really nice thing to just kind of soften that out. And the grainer brush could help you do that, with a lot of ease. This shadow feels a little heavy. Let's just actually get the sense, because the eye socket kind of starts here. So having this darker note carry down so far it's just kind of confusing the reality of what the shadow pattern should be like. And maybe it was making her look like she has bags under her eyes or something. It always looks so nice to have the forms under the eyelid, of the lower eyelid described, but we do want to kind of take a look and make sure that there's no sense that it's starting to look like a dark circle under her eye. I'm just refining the shapes of these like a little bit. I do feel like it needs like a little bit of refinement to the shapes and to the tones. Like maybe this one could be just a little lighter and a little softer. Yeah, that feels better. Alrighty, and so it's the next day and the painting's thoroughly dry, and looking at it now, I just feel like the eyelashes are just a little bit too black. I tried to make them blackish brown when I did them, but the effect feels like too black for like a children's eye. It just feels kind of harsh. So I'm going to take this little mixture. It's like some base flesh color and some burnt sienna, and I'm just going to kind of bring it in right on top of the eyelashes and just kind of bring this browner note right on top. We can still see the texture of the eyelashes. In some ways it was almost good that I put it in a little bit dark so that the texture shows up. If I had put it in brown, it might not read so well. But yeah, now I'm just kind of softening the impact by bringing a little brownish note in. And then I'm going to also mix up some base flesh color and white, similar to the color around the lower eye here. And just basically, it's kind of like a scumble. Like I'm just bringing, it's such a thin layer that it's kind of translucent. So it's called a scumble when it's translucent, even though there's no medium mixed into it. It's like opaque paint, technically, but it's such a thin application that it's going on transparently. And you can see how that just lightened the lower lashes just a drop. And then also I think with the iris, it feels a little harsh overall. Like it just feels a bit too dark. I think, with children, we really want to capture the kind of softness, and a lot of the time that's done with soft edges and sort of soft tones. So I'm going to carry a bit more of that lighter blue note mixed with the Prussian blue and white and a little bit of black. And I'm kind of just going to carry it out towards the edges a little bit more. Maybe I'll shift down to my small round brush, just a small little brush to really get into the detail. And I'm going to use a bit of walnut alkyd medium mixed in so it's kind of a thin coat. And I'm just kind of extending some of these lines outwards to make that black edge just a little bit narrower, basically, so that it's just got kind of a softer feel. And they also kind of extend up just a little bit. So I'm just kind of cutting into the darkest tones. There's still some, left at the outer edges that kind of give the contrast and the visual excitement to the piece, but they're just a little bit more limited in size. Even the top of the pupil, I'm just going to dab this. My painting's dry. This is the next day. So if you do this kind of thing, just wait a day or two for your painting to dry. And I'm sort of just dabbing the notes that I put on top of the pupil and dabbing them just makes it a little bit more translucent since there's some oil in there. So I'm just kind of even going to lighten just the smallest bit, just a one tone lighter. So it's like such a light, soft stroke on top of this black note. Like the touch is sort of making it very transparent just because I'm barely touching my brush. So if I really push down on my brush, it'll make kind of a darker note and really put the full amount of paint on. And now, lastly, let's go in with a brighter highlight. So this is just white with a little bit of blue, and I'm just going to bring out the lightest specular highlight just a bit. There, so that shows you how I would create an eye looking directly at us.
You're not so fancy.